I told you guys that as we go through the book, when we get to passages that have bearing on the conversation of the rapture, that we would pursue that topic and we would talk about it a little bit. And we've arrived at a verse that is very important for that conversation. In verse 9, we run into the word tribulation. And if you've ever been around the rapture crowd, you know that they have a very particular way in the way they use this word. And it usually goes something like this. The tribulation is a 7-year period when God will pour out his wrath on unbelievers. Since the church is not appointed to wrath, we will necessarily have to leave the earth in the rapture before the tribulation begins. And so you can see there are a couple of assumptions here. One is that the tribulation period is 7 years long, and we'll talk about that more later on when we get to chapters 10 and 11, but there's actually no reference to a 7-year period anywhere in Revelation. As a matter of fact, there's no reference to a 7-year period anywhere in the New Testament. You study the second coming of Christ in the Gospels, in Acts, and Paul, and Peter, Revelation. 7-year period is never mentioned, not one time. The advocates of that perspective have taken a verse in Daniel 9:27 and they are superimposing it onto the New Testament. And that verse in Daniel, very questionable as to what it means. There are many schools of thought, but nevertheless, Revelation is a book that quotes the Old Testament hundreds of times. If it wanted that 7-year passage in Daniel, it would go get it, and yet it never does. We'll talk more at another point about the length of the tribulation. The other is that rapturists believe that the word tribulation refers to the wrath of God that is poured out on unbelievers. Since Christians are not appointed to wrath, we leave before that, or so it goes. And so what I want to do is I want to look at every instance of the word tribulation in the book of Revelation, and let's just see if that's what the word means. Is this word a reference to the wrath of God? Our first verse, I, John, your brother and fellow partaker in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance which are in Jesus. Now, I don't like to beat people over the head with Greek, but you'll recall that I introduced one rule of Greek grammar a few weeks ago called Sharp's rule. And this rule says that whenever you have a list of things and you put the word the at the beginning, it means that all of the things on the list kind of refer to the same thing. So if you say the brother and father and son, a Greek audience would understand you're talking about one guy who is a brother and a father and a son. You're not talking about 3 different individuals. However, if you say the brother and the father and the son, and each item gets the word the in front of it, the Greek audience would understand that you're talking about 3 different individuals. The reason why this rule is important is here, and this rule doesn't show up by accident. Whenever a writer uses this, it's quite intentional. Now, you'll notice he says the tribulation and kingdom and endurance which are in Jesus. And this is meant to communicate to us that these 3 concepts go together and they cannot be separated. And you'll notice that on one side he has tribulation and on the other side he has endurance, and he puts kingdom right in the middle. And that's to let you know you cannot have a kingdom life without having tribulation. You cannot have a kingdom life without having endurance. These things are intimately fused together, mutually inclusive, and cannot be separated. Now, the bearing this has on the conversation is obvious. When the rapturist tells you that the tribulation is coming and God's going to pour out his wrath and you have to leave, you need to question that vocabulary, because John seems to assume that he is in tribulation. His Christian audience is in tribulation. And in fact, based on the sentence structure he uses, anybody who's a Christian is going to suffer tribulation. Tribulation is necessary Christian suffering. Now, I want to look at the other examples of the word. This word tribulation is thlipsis. When Jesus addresses the Christians who are at Smyrna, he says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the blasphemy by those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Here we see tribulation is Christian suffering. The next verse, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. Again, tribulation here cannot be interpreted as the wrath of God. In Revelation 7, John will see a vision of Christians in heaven, and the angel will say to him, who are these? And he'll respond by saying, Lord, you know. And the angel said to me, these are the ones who come out of great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, they were not raptured out of great tribulation, as we'll see when we get there. They are martyrs. They came out of the tribulation the hard way. All right. So again, 4 instances of tribulation, all of them positive, all of them Christian suffering. And then finally, you have one negative reference to tribulation. And it's some Christians who are being misled by a false teacher whom John calls Jezebel, where it says, I will throw her onto a bed of sickness and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of her deeds. Now, so you have 4 positive references to tribulation, and you have 1 negative reference to tribulation. And every single time the word occurs, it is a reference to Christian suffering. The word is never used for the wrath of God or the outpouring of God's wrath on unbelievers. And the word is never used in relationship to a 7-year period. So again, you can see here that the fundamental assumptions of rapture theology just don't hold up to the basic vocabulary of the book. And John, he has times when he wants to talk about Christian suffering, and he has times when he wants to talk about unbelievers suffering. And he wants the audience to get it. He doesn't want you to mix the two up or to think that one is the other. So he keeps his vocabulary straight. He uses the word tribulation to talk about Christian suffering, and he never uses it to talk about unbelievers suffering. He uses the word wrath to talk about unbelievers suffering, and he never uses wrath to talk about Christian suffering. And so by keeping that vocabulary separate, he helps you understand who is suffering in this passage. Is it the church or is it the unbelievers? Because we both suffer in the book. We just suffer for different reasons and in different ways. So the word never means a period of God's wrath in all the book of Revelation. And I want to show you that throughout the New Testament, the word is generally used. The rest of the New Testament's not as strict in keeping the word separate. That's kind of John's thing in Revelation. But throughout the rest of the New Testament, this is commonly the case. These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world. Paul was strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith and saying, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance. Good question. Oh, it was in Romans 5:9, I think. I can't go back because it's recording. It won't let me go back to previous slides. You also became imitators of us and of the Lord, having received the word in much tribulation with joy of the Holy Spirit. And this next one's my favorite because Jesus is actually talking about the period prior to the second coming. But notice that tribulation is, we don't leave before it. Jesus comes afterwards. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And of course, you know the rest of this text. Jesus, this is the second coming of Christ. And so the big point to make here is that you'll get a lot of people who are shocked when you say that you believe Christians suffer tribulation in the book of Revelation. They think that Christians leave before tribulation. But it makes no sense to say that Christians leave before necessary Christian suffering. This is like saying, I'm going to sell a car before I ever own one. It doesn't really hold. It doesn't really make sense. And so my encouragement to you is whenever you meet a person with this 7-year tribulation idea who says we need to leave first, ask them to show you a place in the New Testament that refers to 7 years. And ask them to show you the place in Revelation where tribulation is the wrath of God. And you will find that you are very disappointed with the answers you get to those questions if they are able to give you an answer at all. I was on the island called Patmos because of the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Now, Osborne tells us the two aspects, Word of God and testimony of Jesus, are not separate but complementary. Due to their frequent appearance in the book, they become a semi-technical formula for gospel truth and faithful Christian witness to it. And the Word of God is used in Scripture for prophetic utterances as well as for the apostolic message. The reason why I bring that up is people wonder, if the Emperor Domitian has sent John. Remember last time we talked a lot about Emperor Domitian and the dating of the book of Revelation. We'll talk some more about that here shortly. If the Emperor Domitian has sent John into exile on the Isle of Patmos for the word of God, well, what was it? Was it because he was preaching the apostolic message, he was preaching the gospel, or is it because he already had visions? What does it mean by the word of God? Is this prophecy, or is this the gospel message? And the truth of the matter is we don't know. The word can go, this phrase can be used either way. The phrase word of God occurs 7 times in Revelation. If you were here at our first night meeting, you'll recall that word of God is, when things occur 7 times in Revelation, it's because they're very important, they're very special. 7 is the number of Christ when he connects heaven and earth. And finally, the testimony of Jesus. This means that Jesus had a testimony. He had a witness. He had a message to give to the world. And now that he is gone, he has handed that off to us. And the message that he carried, the testimony that he carried, we now carry. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet. This is the first occurrence of the term Lord's Day in all of Christian literature, which refers to Sunday. Now, it may be a subversion of the Emperor's Day, which was the first day of each month. So in the first century world, emperors were thought to be divine, were the Son of God, and each person had to pay homage and acknowledge the divine lineage of the emperor's family. And of course, Christians could not do this. So they oftentimes took titles that belonged to the emperor, such as Kyrios, which is Lord, and Son of God, and the only name under heaven by which men are saved, etc. These were all titles that existed before the Christian faith. They were titles of Caesar. They were titles of the emperor. And Christians is a way of saying the emperor is not the Lord of all creation, and he is not divine. Only Jesus is the Lord of all creation. They would take these titles away from the emperor and give them to Jesus. And that may be what the Lord's Day, what this language is all about. I will just add to that Christians were happy to pay their taxes and to submit to the laws of the land. But when the government came in, as it did in Domitian's time, and was insisting that the churches participate in idolatry, this is where a book like Revelation was written to say we have to take a stand against that. Now, there are some parallels here between this scene and one in Ezekiel. And I won't read it, but I'll just tell you that when Ezekiel was commissioned to prophesy, there's a great sound behind him, and it was at the end of 7 days, and he encountered, the living creatures that were around the throne of God, etc. Well, that's what we have here with John. There's a voice behind him. It's Sunday, so it's after the 7 days of the week. It's a voice like a trumpet. All these things that showed up in Ezekiel, the creatures around the throne, all of these things that Ezekiel saw at the beginning of his commissioning are things that John sees at the beginning of his commissioning. Now, that's on purpose. It's to let us know that, one, John is a prophet in stature like Ezekiel, and two, the vision of Revelation will be very similar to the book of Ezekiel. A good example of this is Ezekiel ends with a vision of the New Jerusalem, just as Revelation ends with a vision of the New Jerusalem. Ezekiel eats a scroll. You'll recall that in Ezekiel chapter 3. In Revelation 10, John will also eat a scroll. I get somebody to read the next section, please.
Saying, write in a book what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, and to Smyrna, and to Pergamum, and to Thyatira, and to Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me. And having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the middle of the lampstands I saw one like a son of man, clothed in a robe, reaching to the feet, and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white like wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze when it has been made to glow in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters.
It says, then I turned to see the voice. A lot of people think this is just indirect language, a way of saying, not that he actually turned to see the voice, because there's no way to actually do this, but as a way of saying that, he turned to see the person who had the voice. And that may very well be an explanation, but in Revelation, which has so much interesting imagery and so many allusions to the Old Testament, there's probably more to this line than that. When God appears to the children of Israel on Mount Sinai, it says all the people saw the voice. and the lightning and flashes and the sound of the trumpet. And so here we have these people, John seeing the voice, which is like a trumpet. And most scholars will recognize that here that there is an allusion to Mount Sinai, to the theophany. And theophany is just a fancy word that means God appearing to his people. And Revelation, for various reasons, will allude to the Mount Sinai theophany many, many times in this book, and we'll pay close attention to that and kind of investigate why that is. But here, it seems to be, again, about the importance of revelation. It was supremely important when Yahweh spoke to his people through the theophany at Mount Sinai, because this is where the covenant was established. And like so, it's very important what God now has to say to his people, the church, through John on the Isle of Patmos. And so this is like a new Mount Sinai revelation. Whatever this book is going to say, it's supremely important, just as the message of Moses was. Now, we want to pay attention to something that will occur in Revelation, which may seem a little odd, but it's actually very helpful to recognize that this happens. In Revelation, John will hear something, and then he'll immediately see something. He'll hear, and then he'll see. And this pattern, recognizing it and how it functions, will help us in some of the trickier portions of the book. When an audition is followed by a vision, it means we are seeing two different aspects of the same reality. And oftentimes what he hears and what he sees will seem to be like opposites. They'll seem to be very different things. For example, in chapter 5, John doesn't see the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He hears about it. He's told the Lion of the tribe of Judah has overcome. And then he turns to see it, and he doesn't see a lion. What he sees is the lamb. Now, a lion and a lamb are very different. One is a predator and one is an animal of prey. But nevertheless, even though they are very different, they both apply to Jesus. Whatever John hears and then sees, well, what he sees helps to interpret what he just heard, because it's going to refer to the same thing. For example, when discussing the church, it will say that John will hear about the bride. And then when he goes to see the bride, he won't see a woman. He will see a city decked out in jewels. And again, that seems very different. A bride is like a person who would live in a city. Wouldn't be a city itself, but nevertheless, the church of God is both a bride and a city. That is, a place, a community where there is sacred space, where man and God can live together. The first instance of this, because John hears a trumpet, and then he sees a menorah and the priestly clothing of Jesus. Now, trumpets mean a variety of things in the Bible, but in Revelation, they are especially associated with the reign and the kingship of Christ. We know this because there are 7 trumpets coming up that we'll examine. And when the 7th one sounds, it says, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. So John hears a voice like a trumpet, kingship. And then he turns and he sees a lampstand, which is an instrument that the priests use in the temple. And he sees these garments that Jesus is wearing, which are like the garments of the high priest. Again, these seem to be opposite things, but they refer to the same person. Because in the Old Testament, one could be a priest, but he could not be a king. Or one could be a king, but he could not be a priest. Nobody could be both, because kings were from the tribe of Judah, and priests were from the tribe of Levi. Nevertheless, Jesus, just like he is both the lion and the lamb, he is both the high priest who takes away the sins of the world, and he's also the King of Kings. And so he hears something kingly, sees something priestly, but both refer to the same thing. That is, both refer to the same Jesus. Now, the reason why this is so important is because one of the big interpretive questions in the book of Revelation is, who are the 144,000 sons of Israel that we will encounter in chapter 7? And this is a question that I think many people end up wrong. And it's precisely because they didn't pay attention to this pattern, to this interpretive technique. Because when we get to the 144,000 in chapter 7, John will not see them. He will hear them. And that is good for us as interpreters, because we know that's just an audition. Whatever he sees right after that helps us understand who the 144,000 are. And so John hears and then he sees. And even though what he hears and sees seems so different, they refer to the same thing. And I'll remind us of this principle time and time again as we encounter it in the book. Clothed in a robe reaching to the feet and girded across his chest with a golden sash. Like I just said, high priest garment. He would wear these long garments. That the sash thing on his chest helps to hold the the gems, the jewels and stones that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. This is how Jesus is dressed in this text. I don't know if this man is high priest just for Halloween or if he does this every day, but nevertheless, I thought I'd share it because I have a friend who looks just like this. And the interesting thing is he's like a really theological dude. Like he reads Hebrew and Greek and Latin, and you know, he studies liturgy all the time. And anyway, I've been meaning to send this to him because I really think that's him. Nathan, don't you think this looks like Kenneth?
Oh, yeah. The only thing is missing is the shofar.
Yeah, and this guy looks kind of cocky, but I still don't think he's quite as cocky as Kenneth.
No.
Being that smart has consequences, I suppose. Read about the garments of the high priest. You'll find those in Exodus chapter 28. You just look at the description of the high priest in Exodus 28, then look at Jesus throughout the book of Revelation, and you know, same thing. All right, who can tell me what scene in the Bible this is? Okay, do you know where that is? This is Daniel chapter 7, where the Ancient of Days, God is symbolized by a figure who, like you say, a judgment is taking place and he is unrolling the scrolls and there's a river of fire, etc. Now, Revelation here says that, talking about Jesus, I saw one like a son of man, and his head and his hair were white like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. Now, the reason this is interesting is because the Messiah, the Son of Man, approaches God, who is the Ancient of Days, in Daniel chapter 7, in order to receive authority over a kingdom. And in that passage, the Messiah doesn't have the white hair. God has the white hair. Now, the interesting thing here about Revelation is the white hair is now on the Messiah. And the reasons for this are twofold. One, this is a way of affirming the divinity of Jesus. Jesus shares in the symbolic appearance of the Father because he shares in the Father's divine nature. And also, the white hair talks about the ancientness of God, that is, his pre-existence. He existed before there was creation. So as Jesus takes on this characteristic, this shows us, as John says at the beginning of his gospel, that Jesus existed before the world was made. His feet were like burnished bronze when it has been made to glow in a furnace. This is interesting because we only encounter this vision 2 times in the Bible, other than here, and they're both features of angels. Angels get the feet like bronze in Ezekiel. Angels get the feet like bronze in Daniel. And so the question is, why was a feature taken from these angels and given to Jesus? Now we can see clearly why he got the hair of the Ancient of Days, because Jesus is divine, like the Father. But why does he get these characteristics of angels? And there are 2 basic ideas about this. And one is that this is designed to show that Jesus is the angel of the Lord from the Old Testament narratives. If you've ever read Genesis or the book of Numbers or Judges, you know that the angel of the Lord will show up, and then you see that he's not the angel, that he is the incarnation of God. He speaks of himself as being God. And this may be a way of saying Jesus is the angel of the Lord in his pre-incarnation. That is, before Jesus was ever born of a virgin in Bethlehem, whenever he would show up in the Old Testament, he was the angel of the Lord who shows up and is the embodiment of Israel's God. That's one idea. Another idea is to say, again, that this is just about the commissioning of John, that whenever Daniel and Ezekiel, these major hitters of prophets, they're prophets who hit hard in Israel's history, not that prophets hit them. That whenever these guys were commissioned to prophesy, they would see heavenly beings who had feet like bronze. And so if John's prophecy is on the scale and has the level of authority that those prophets had, he also sees a heavenly being with feet like bronze. Now, this is probably not an either or. It may be a combination of both, but nevertheless, it is interesting. Jesus here has this. Now, you can search high and low on the internet trying to find a good picture of Jesus's feet like bronze in a furnace, and you won't find anything. I mean, this is the best one, and it's like at a funny angle. If you type in Jesus's feet in any image search engine, You'll get a lot of stuff about the woman, who anoints his feet and dries it with her hair. Lots of great artwork on that, but not much on Jesus' feet in Revelation. And the meaning of these feet we'll talk about more when they show up again. Somebody read this section, please.
In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword. And his face was like the sun shining in its strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man. And he placed his right hand on me, saying, Do not be afraid, I am the first and the last, and the living one. And I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death and of Hades.
This one as well, sorry.
Therefore write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. As for the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, and the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches.
Thank you. The Old Testament background for this image of a sword coming out of his mouth. The first instance, this is actually a rod that comes out of the Messiah's mouth in Isaiah chapter 11. Nevertheless, scholars have recognized its importance for this image in the book of Revelation. And this passage in Isaiah speaks about, how the poor are taken advantage of by those who have political power and those who have wealth. And God will come and he will do judgment, and he will set that right, and he will vindicate the poor. Now, it's interesting, probably very relevant, really, that a passage like this would influence the book of Revelation, because when we get to future points in the book, particularly chapter 18, when it discusses Mystery Babylon, we'll see that this is a major motif in this book, that the rich and the powerful are lording it over God's creation, and there will be a reckoning for that. And the other one is in Isaiah 49, where it says, He has made my mouth like a sharp sword, and he says, I will also make you a light of the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Revelation is very concerned with intimating to us that God is not just the God of the Jewish people, that he is the God of all races of people. And that is the backdrop of this Isaiah passage, and again, has tremendous bearing on the major themes and ideas in the book of Revelation. And we'll encounter this image a number of times. The sword in his mouth is used to fight against unrepentant Christians in Sardis, to smite the nations, and to slay the armies of the kings of the earth. And so a very prominent picture. We'll see it many times in the imagery. The sword that comes out of his mouth is an unusual Greek word for a sword. The more common Greek word is one that would refer to the Roman short sword. So Romans, they had these great big shields, and they had their phalanx. They would all line up together. You've probably seen 300, the movie, where the Greeks would do the same thing. That they had a short sword and they had a great big shield, and they would make breaks in their phalanx, in their wall, and they would just do a short stabbing motion. That's the more usual word for Greek sword. But a different word is used here that refers to the Thracian broadsword. And this is a massive sword. This is more like a sword you would hold with 2 hands, or that you would have as you ride on horseback and you need to reach down and really get some distance and do some damage. And the idea seems to be simple. Rome, with its short sword, is dominating the world and taking advantage of the world and exploiting the world and persecuting the church. But they need to be warned that Christ has a much larger sword of judgment that he will use against them if they do not lay off of persecuting his church. If you don't know what Thrace is, I didn't either. I had to look it up. But Thrace is this region in the empire that's right above Turkey. And you'll recall that the 7 churches to whom this letter is addressed, that those 7 churches are in Turkey. And so Thrace is their neighbor. They would know exactly what type of sword is being talked about. It's the Thracian broadsword. It's that big sword that our neighbors have. And I was looking at this today, and it made me think, so many of the popular teachers on Revelation on the radio and the TV, they like to say that the ancient church could not have understood the book of Revelation, and the church over the centuries could not have understood it, that the meanings of the book of Revelation are only available to us in like the last few years before the second coming. which is complete nonsense, as we're going to find out. Nevertheless, it's interesting that the sword used is one that the original audience would know about. They would know about this because this is their neighbors, as were the modern audience, much to the contrary of what the popular teachers have to say. We actually have to go and look this stuff up. It's harder for us to understand Revelation than it was for the original church, not vice versa. First time I'd seen this image, I kind of thought, well, you know, that's kind of crazy. Why did they put such a big sword coming out of his mouth? But as it turned out, you know, that's the idea. Great big sword. And they tried to capture here the notion of his eyes being like fire. It says that Jesus has the keys to death and Hades. Death and Hades is a hindiatus. And don't worry, you'll probably never hear that word again in your life, so no need to memorize it. And it's a two-word expression that refers to the same thing. And we have lots of these in English. So say I was to have a baby pig, and I said that the pig is nice and fat. That is a hindiatus, because you wouldn't hear me say that and think when I said he's nice and fat that I meant he's nice in character, or that, you know, he's a very sweet pig and he's nice to everybody. Nice and fat is just an expression that means he's really fat. All right. Now, death and Hades are kind of used like this. These both refer to the same aspect of dying. They both refer to death, just to slightly different aspects of dying. Death, of course, refers to the physical body quitting on you. And then Hades is a reference to the realm of the dead. In the Old Testament, Sheol, the underworld, where the souls of the dead go, that's what people in the time of Jesus referred to as Hades. Now, the ancients did not think of Hades as just being one big place of punishment. They thought of Hades as having two compartments, a compartment for righteous souls who will live in bliss, and a compartment for wicked souls who don't live in bliss. You'll remember this from Luke chapter 17, where in the parable of Lazarus, that Lazarus looks up his eyes and he can see the torment of the rich man on the other side of a chasm, on the other side of a barrier. So he's in bliss, and the bad guy is not in bliss, but they're in the same place. Now that's the way the ancients thought of Hades, an underground realm of the dead that was divided into two compartments. Now, of course, the harrowing of hell is the ancient Christian doctrine that after his resurrection, Christ evacuated the righteous souls of Hades and took them to heaven. And so now only the wicked remain in Hades. And that seems to be the idea in the book of Revelation, because whenever we see death in Hades, it's always negative. It's never a good thing. Now, various divinities were depicted as possessing the keys to Hades in the ancient world. And this is a very common thing you find in the Bible generally. We've talked about this a little bit already tonight, but especially in the book of Revelation. That Revelation wants to take the titles and honors that were given to other divinities and strip them away from those false gods and confer those titles and honors upon Christ. So in Turkey, where our churches are, they're used to the paganism of their place and time, talking about the goddess who had the keys to the underworld. Well, this is this text way of saying, no, the goddess doesn't have the keys to the underworld. Jesus has the keys to the underworld. Saying, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. Therefore, write the things that you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. Now, last time we talked about the Alpha and the Omega. We talked about the one who was and who is coming, and these various other titles, but we didn't talk about this one. This one comes from the book of Isaiah, and it's a title that Yahweh uses whenever he's going to tell you what happened in the past and what happened in the future. I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me, there is no God. Who then is like me? Let him declare and lay out before me what has happened since I established my ancient people, and what is yet to come. Yes, let them foretell what will come. Of course, this is an affirmation again of Jesus' divinity. He has taken a title that is used of God, and it is now applied to Jesus as a way of affirming his divinity. And again, I was talking about how important the Old Testament context is for understanding the book of Revelation. You go find this title in the Old Testament, and it's right where God says, I'm going to tell you what happened and what will happen. Well, that's exactly what Jesus is doing in this very passage when he says that he's the first and the last. Now, the things which you have seen refer to Jesus' appearance in the first chapter. The things which are refer to the situation of the seven churches in chapters 2 and 3, and the things which will be refer to the prophetic, I shouldn't say it like that, the futuristic portion of the book that begins in chapter 4 onward. And we'll prove that when we get there. John is pretty good about letting us know where we are in this chronology and in these stages of the book. We want to notice that the right hand of Jesus occurs in 2 verses back to back, and that's probably not an accident. In his right hand he held 7 stars. When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man, and he placed his right hand on me, saying, "Do not be afraid, I am the first and the last." Now, in the Bible, the right hand can signify power, comfort, or investiture, which is just a way of saying that, you put your right hand on someone in order to acknowledge their authority. But here the idea seems to be comfort, because John is afraid and he falls down, and so Jesus puts his right hand on him in order to comfort him. And that probably helps us, is intended to help us with the previous verse, because Christ is holding 7 stars in his right hand. Whatever these 7 stars represent, whoever they are, they probably need the same comfort that John needs. So we want to recognize that, and we'll come back to it here in just a moment. First, we want to talk about where this imagery comes from. At the top right, you will see a coin that was minted by the Roman Empire during the time of Emperor Domitian, and it is of Domitian's son with 7 stars in his hands. As Nelson Crable says, I recommended Nelson Crable last week. You'll recall the book Apocalypse and Allegiance. He has a great discussion on this. Propaganda of the Roman Empire reinforced the notion that emperors controlled the world. A coin from the reign of Domitian, most likely the emperor when John wrote Revelation, features an icon of the infant son of the emperor seated on a globe. So here's the idea. Emperors at this point in history usually were not considered to be gods. All right, they didn't become gods until they died. So an emperor would die, and then people in Rome would go out on the hills and whatever, and they would keep watch. And then somebody would run into the Senate and said, "I have seen the soul of the emperor ascending to heaven in order to become a god." And so after somebody had come in and said this, the Senate would be like, "Okay, well, there you have it. We have a witness who's seen the soul of the emperor ascending to be divinized to become a god." And then the Senate would make it official that he is a god. Now that means the living emperor would be called the Son of God, because his father has died and become a god. So now as the living emperor is Son of God. And again, you can see how this is horribly blasphemous to Jewish and especially Christian people. Well, Domitian changed the game. He wanted to be acknowledged as being God even while he was still alive, before he died. And all the ancient pagan sources kind of give him this reputation that not only did he require people to call him God in writing, you had to talk to him that way when you've seen him face to face. He would go in to talk to the Senate, and the way that they had to speak to him was to call him God and Lord. And in the next chapter, we'll talk a lot more about Emperor Domitian. Nevertheless, his son died in his infancy. And in order to honor his son, the Son of God, because Domitian is a god supposedly, his son was depicted as holding 7 stars. So now you can see what Revelation has done here to take a shot at the empire. An image of the Son of God holding 7 stars has been stripped away from Domitian's family and conferred on Jesus Christ. Now this is one of the reasons most scholars think that Revelation was written in a response to Emperor Domitian and in a response to his blasphemy and his persecution of the church. Because this is not the only place in Revelation where an image is taken off of Roman money minted in Domitian's time and applied to Jesus. He consistently subverts and upstages the empire. If they're going to put a glorious image of the emperor on a coin, Revelation is going to take it away from the emperor and give it to Jesus. Now, there are folks who think that Revelation was written earlier. This is a minority school of thought, and it's definitely not the most common view in church history. But there's a school of thought out there that says Revelation was written under Emperor Nero in the 60s. Well, this certainly wouldn't be the case because Revelation makes references to coins in Domitian's time. You'll recall that in chapter 17, there's a woman riding on a beast that has 7 heads, and then it tells you that the 7 heads are 7 hills. Well, interestingly enough, in Domitian's time, there's a coin minted that we'll look at when we get to that chapter of a woman sitting on 7 hills. And so Revelation keeps doing this because one of the reasons Revelation is written is to remind Christians not to compromise faith and faithfulness in order to participate in the Roman economy. In order to really participate in the Roman economy and the Roman trade guilds, one had to burn incense for the emperor and for the gods. And there were a lot of Christians who wanted to do that, not because they believed in the emperor and the gods, but just so that they could participate in the economy. And Revelation's telling them, if you do that, if you compromise faith in order to make some money, you've taken the mark of the beast. Again, we'll talk about the mark of the beast when we get there. Nevertheless, one of the powerful ways to communicate this warning is to say that money that you're so concerned about is glorifying the emperor and giving honors to the emperor that only belong to Christ. As for the mystery of the 7 stars, which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. The lampstands here, obviously, that's clear enough, but who are the 7 angels of the churches? There are various schools of thought, and we'll talk about 3 of them. Does each church have its own guardian angel or patron angel in the unseen realm? This view, it seems, in the literature has become a lot more popular in about the last 10 or 15 years. And, you know, it's possible because we find in Daniel chapter 12 that the people of God have the angel Michael assigned to them. We see that the nation of Persia has an angel assigned to them. When Paul talks about Christians worshiping in 1 Corinthians, he says that there are angels around us when we worship. The notion that each church could have its own representative angel in the unseen realm is not a far-fetched idea, biblically speaking. However, thinking that's what Revelation is talking about poses a number of issues and problems. First of all, why would God need John to deliver a message to angels? Why couldn't God just get the message to them in the unseen realm instead of using a human intermediary? You'll recall the train of transmission in the very first verse of the book, that God gave the revelation to Jesus, then Jesus gave it to an angel, and then the angel pitched it off to John. Well, now John is pitching it back to the angels, if this is true. And it seems awfully weird that John would have to go give them the message. Surely they have some other pipeline of information. Now, there are other issues. The angels of these 7 churches seem to be responsible for human sin. To the angel of the church in Sardis, write, and again, these are addressed to the angels themselves. Write, he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars says this, I know your deeds, and that you have a name that are alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen the things which remain, which are about to die. For I have not found your deeds completed in the sight of my God. When we get to Laodicea, the last church referenced, the one that gets the most negative rebuke, we find it's a prosperity gospel church. And you know, because they have been financially successful, they necessarily think that means God has blessed them and that they're on the right track. And Jesus will scold them more than anybody. And that whole message is addressed to the angel of the church at Laodicea. And so it seems awfully awkward here in Sardis that an angel would have a reputation of being alive and yet he's dead. This seems to apply to human beings at the church. So you get into all sorts of issues and problems when you think these addresses are to actual angels in the unseen realm. And so that is probably not a good explanation. Are the 7 churches themselves the 7 churches, the 7 angels of the churches? My water bottle just will not participate. I'm sorry. This is a real possibility because there are definitely places in the book's imagery where angels represent the church because we, you know, just as angels have sharing the heavenly presence of the Father and they deliver messages for the Lord, so the church is the same. We have a liturgical reality where we participate in heaven and we deliver the message of the gospel to the earth. In Revelation 14, 3 angels will proclaim the gospel and a message of judgment. When we get there, we'll see that they represent the church living out its calling. But this view has a problem as well. It creates a strange redundancy in the text. Verse 20 just said that the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Making the 7 stars the churches also is unnecessary duplicity. So if Jesus is like, well, these 7 lampstands represent the 7 churches, but over here I got this other image, 7 stars, which represent 7 angels, which are actually also the 7 churches. It's just very awkward, and it seems unnecessary to add an additional symbol for the 7 churches, and then this one to have kind of the indirect roundabout way of getting to it. And so for that reason, you'll find that most Revelation interpreters reject this perspective. The position where I'm going to fall is that the angels represent the pastors of these churches. In apocalyptic literature, angels provide encouragement and interpret the vision that the prophet has seen. Presumably, the leaders at each of the 7 churches would need to do these 2 things in their churches in a time of persecution. They would need to encourage the people, the flock, as they undergo persecution. As this book, Revelation, arrives and the churches that receive it begin to study it and learn it, obviously the leadership would take on the primary role of explaining the book and teaching it and using the Old Testament in order to interpret the symbolism of the book. And you'll recall also that the 7 stars are in the right hand of Jesus. Just as Jesus had to comfort John, so he has to comfort these 7 stars. That's why they're in his right hand. And you can, of course, the pastors of these churches in a time of persecution would need the comfort and presence of Christ. So the imagery just fits. There are other places in the book where people are elevated to the level of angels. And what I don't mean by this is that you die and you get wings and you become an angel. That's not a biblical teaching. What I mean is that angels in this book exist in heaven. They enjoy God's presence, and God uses them to run and to rule his cosmos. Well, Revelation will consistently remind us that if we are faithful and we overcome, we will be like the angels. We will rule and govern God's cosmos in the age to come. And this plays out in all sorts of ways. I could have chosen a number of texts. There's a passage where the wall of the New Jerusalem is being measured, and it will say it's 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. And when we get there, we'll see this is not about yardsticks. Equating the angels and the human's measurement here is, there's going to be symbolism and mathematics involved in this verse, which are geared at showing that when human beings are righteous and they overcome, they're elevated to the status of angels. And so it should be no surprise that these 7 pastors who have to pastor these churches in a time of persecution, that they would receive this honorary title. Revelation consistently represents the church as, in some sense, already present in heaven. The church is also the gateway through which heaven. Revelation, we will refer to it as the liturgical reality, because it is in our corporate worship and in the Eucharist that the church is present in heaven, where we participate in the heavenly and angelic worship of the Lord. One of the ways that Revelation will want to communicate this reality is by using heavenly language about angels when it talks about people in the church, and by using churchy language on the earth when it talks about angelic beings in heaven. For example, in chapter 4, we're going to encounter these figures, these 24 elders who have crowns on their heads and are around the throne of God. And there's always been an argument about who they are. I'm going to say that they're heavenly beings for reasons that I'll explain when I get there. They seem to be the same heavenly beings that we see in a number of passages in the Old Testament, which are God's counsel, those heavenly beings who are charged with the responsibility. They're the highest level of hierarchy of heavenly being who have to reign and rule over the creation on God's behalf. Nevertheless, they're called elders. Now, an elder in the New Testament is usually a leader in the church, right? But this language is taken and applied to these heavenly beings. So just the same in these few chapters here, the pastors are called angels. By mixing the heavenly and earthly language, this is one of the ways of saying the church has become the kingdom of heaven on earth. And the only other thing I'll say about that is, while we will talk about this in terms of a liturgical reality, that is liturgical referring to the church gathering together to worship and participate together, liturgy is not the only way this works in the New Testament. Sometimes It's an ethical reality. You'll recall the Lord's Prayer, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The rest of the prayer is geared at explaining what it means for heaven to be inaugurated on earth. Give us this day our daily bread. It's a call to the church to live up to its social ethic, to make sure that everybody gets enough to eat, to make sure that the poor get enough to eat. When everybody receives their daily bread, then heaven has been manifested on the earth.
Hey, Justin, you might ask a question real quick?
Sure.
Isn't the Greek word for angel just, is it angelos, just means messenger?
Yeah, angelos means messenger, and so here's the deal. In the Old Testament, you get heavenly beings who are not angels, right? They're not messengers. In the Old Testament, angelos is a reference to a heavenly being who has the job of delivering a message. But there are plenty of heavenly beings that are not angels. Now, in the New Testament vocabulary, that changes. In the New Testament, an angel is a heavenly being whether he's delivering messages or not. We'll see that a lot here. We'll see angels, heavenly beings in this book that are called angels that never deliver any messages. And so the vocabulary sort of changes between Old and New Testaments. That idea that I know you're aware of really works in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, the language kind of collapses. If it's a heavenly being, it's an angel. In the Old Testament, if it's a heavenly being who delivers a message, it's an angel. So a little bit different.
Does that go for saying that you're tying that word into pastors, that is referring to them as angels, it's just referring to them as messengers? Like, if a pastor acts as a messenger of the Lord at that time, he can be considered an angel without being a heavenly being, right?
Right. And yeah, I mean, there are human beings who are called angelos, who are called messengers. Now, in Revelation, that's not the idea. The idea is definitely heavenly language.
Yeah.
Right. Because elsewhere in the book of Revelation, there's this penchant, there's this constant need to show that when Christians are faithful, that they acquire the status of angels. And so, since we'll see that so many times, when we get here, these pastors are called angels, it just seems, just one more pea in that pod, essentially. Am I understanding your question correctly? Am I answering it right?
I think so. I don't know the answer to this, right?
Yeah. So, the word angelos can mean messenger, whether human or heavenly. That is what the lemma means. That's what the vocabulary word means. However, in the New Testament, the word has a tendency, when it talks about a heavenly being, it doesn't have to be someone delivering a message. It's just a heavenly being. Now, here it could be. There is a perspective out there that says this is not heavenly language. It's just saying that they are messengers. Now, the problem with that is nowhere else in the book of Revelation is the word angelos simply used of a human messenger without a heavenly connotation. So it's definitely comparing them to heavenly beings. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That's another example that Jesus gives. When we walk in personal sanctification, we manifest the kingdom of heaven on the earth. And so whenever the church functions faithfully and ethically, we are bringing heaven to earth. However, in the book of Revelation, the focus is especially liturgical. We see so many of these worship scenes, and so the book will consistently refer to the church as being in heaven, even when you look at the passage and the church is clearly on the earth. And that'll become important to us in later chapters to recognize that just because the church is described as being in heaven, you read one or two verses later and they're suffering persecution. Well, they're obviously not literally in heaven. They just have a heavenly presence by virtue of the Eucharist, by virtue of liturgy, by virtue of bringing the kingdom ethics of Jesus down to the earth.